в западных элитах очень сильное желание заморозить существующее положение, несправедливое положение вещей в международных делах. Они привыкли столетиями набивать брюхо человеческой плотью, а карманы деньгами. Но они должны понять, что бал вампиров заканчивается.
So in response to French President Macron's statements about not ruling out the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine,
et d'envoyer des troupes occidentales françaises en Ukraine.
Vous êtes assis devant moi. Est-ce que vous êtes debout? Non. Est-ce que vous excluez de vous lever à la fin de cette interview? Bien sûr, vous n'allez pas l'exclure. La Russie ne peut pas et ne doit pas gagner cette guerre.
Russian President Vladimir Putin did an interview with Russia's state news agency that basically warned the West that if American troops were deployed to Russia or Ukraine, Russia would see the threat as an intervention.
If we return to Macron, maybe he decided to take revenge on Russia in this way for the fact that we stepped on his tail in Africa. Did we have to stand there and be afraid? He probably didn't expect us to be so active there. Yes, I think he has some kind of resentment.
President Putin also noted, according to Reuters, that so far in the 2 years of conflict in Ukraine, Russia has never faced the need to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. However, President Macron's comments have been criticized by not only other European countries, but most interestingly, by his own French military experts. And that is what I want to get into in this video today. So today's video will be about a revealing article in a popular French magazine called Marianne that is behind a paywall, but which analyzes several confidential French defense reports that discuss the true situation in Ukraine and, not surprisingly, how bad the Ukrainian military is doing right now. The article discusses the failed counteroffensive of summer 2023, the current state of troops in the Ukrainian army as compared to the Russian army, the chronic underestimation of the Russian army by the Western media, which it suggests is done purposely on the part of the Russians through their doctrine of Maskirovka, and finally, the Battle of Avdiivka, how it fell and what it means for the rest of the conflict. Lastly, it suggests that President Macron's comments were out of panic rather than the boldness which he wanted to project. And this is an opinion I also shared in one of my recent videos. So without further ado, as the French like to say, let's get into it. So the article says that by not ruling out sending troops to Ukraine, Emmanuel Macron caused an outcry in Europe and received American disavowal.
Why the U.S. oppose any nation sending troops to?
Those are sovereign decisions that a nation has to make. I can just speak for this sovereign nation and this commander-in-chief, and he's made it clear that we will not put U.S. boots on the ground.
Several French soldiers interviewed by Marianne say, "We must not deceive ourselves," they say, "in the face of the Russians. We are an army of butts," mocked a senior official convinced that sending of French troops to the Ukrainian front would simply be unreasonable. At the Ministry of the Armed Forces, in Sébastien Lecornu's entourage, and Sébastien Lecornu, by the way, is the Minister of the Armed Forces for France. The minister said, and I quote, "The state of the forces in Ukraine is very worrying," and asks, how did we get there? The article cites several confidential defense reports which Marianne was able to consult and which evoke, and I quote again, "a critical situation as explained in 3 observations." For months, European chancelleries wanted to believe that the Kiev counteroffensive of the spring of 2023, supported by Western equipment, would send the Russian army back to Moscow. The report said that the planning imagined in Kiev and the Western staffers proved to be disastrous. The planners thought that as soon as the first Russian lines of defense were crossed, the entire front would collapse. The report criticized that these fundamental preliminary phases were made without taking into account the morale of the enemy on defense. That is, the Russian soldiers' willingness to cling to the field, which the report said revealed the, and I quote, bankruptcy of planning of the Western camp. So a quick point here. This is what we call blinded by hubris. The West either believed Ukrainian reports about the battlefield success blindly, or was so misguided by their flawed view of Russian incompetence that they really thought, and worse yet, they planned based on the delusion that the Russian army was so demoralized by the fall offensives of 2022 in Kherson and in Kharkiv that they would just collapse in the face of Western equipment. And based on this delusion, they sent Ukrainians to their death with that plan in mind. That is, that the men would just show up and the Russian enemy would flee. And I keep saying this, and I agree with Scott Ritter, that whoever sanctioned that summer 2023 counteroffensive should be court-martialed for criminal negligence.
Let me put it this way. If this was an American counteroffensive and the Americans suffered these casualties, Congress would hold a hearing and General Milley would come through and talk about the training that has been prepared, and he would be court-martialed for being criminally negligent, because what he has done is taken people that we know are insufficiently trained for the task, and we put them in combat anyways. Because to send these Ukrainian soldiers into those Russian defenses with equipment they don't know how to use, with tactics they don't know how to employ, with an operational doctrine that is broken, because at a minimum you require a modicum of air support. There is no air support. The Russians are slaughtering these people before they even get near the front line. And as they get near the front line, helicopters are going up. You know how many helicopters the Ukrainians have shot down, Russian helicopters, in a very intensive combat zone? Zero, which means they don't have air defense because the Russians have taken it apart. This is murder. This is mass murder.
Another lesson the article refers to is the inadequacy of the training of Ukrainian soldiers and executives. It says in the newly formed brigades, training did not last more than 3 weeks. In the absence of executives and a significant volume of veterans, these Ukrainian Year 2 soldiers, as the article calls them, were launched to attack Russian fortification lines that proved impregnable. They did this without any air support, with disparate and less efficient Western equipment than the old Soviet equipment, which the report described as being old-fashioned but easy to maintain and suitable for use in degraded mode. Ukrainian troops, they said, had no hope of breaking through. Then we must add a Russian dominance in the field of electronic interference, which seriously affected the Ukrainian use of drones and command systems. And get this line here. Documents say the Russian army today is the tactical and technical reference for thinking and implementing defensive mode, writes the report. So in essence, the French military regard the Russian army as the best army in terms of defensive warfare. And maybe that's why US News rated them as the #1 ranked military in the world, ahead of the United States of America. The article continues, not only does Moscow have heavy engineering equipment that allowed it to build defensive structures, and compared the almost total absence of this equipment on the Ukrainian side and the impossibility of Westerners to provide it to the Ukrainians quickly, but the 1,200-kilometer front known as the Surovikin defensive line has been mined in enormous proportions by the Russians. 7,000 kilometers of mines, the article says. I made this point in my video about the true purpose of Bakhmut, that when you see the kind of investment President Putin put into the defense line that runs from Kherson all the way up to Belarus, it is clear as day that Russia was very serious about this conflict and considered it an existential threat for them. It was also clear to me that the Battle of Bakhmut was really a distraction to allow the Russian army the time and the space to hire civilian contractor firms to build this massive defense line in the middle of a war without having the Ukrainian army the time and space to interrupt them. But there are more observations from these French defense reports that really show how mismatched the two sides are in this conflict. The Russians, it says, have also been able to manage the reserve troops to guarantee operational endurance. According to the classified document, the article says that Moscow strengthens its units before their complete wear and tear, mixes recruits with seasoned troops, preserves regular rest periods in the rear, and has always had a coherent force reservoir to manage the unexpected. Now play that statement back and then put it in your mind and compare it to what you heard daily in Western liberal media reports about Russians with low morale, poorly trained Russian troops, and inept logistical lines.
The operations that we're seeing by the Russian tank crews are completely amateurish. I assume that the people crewing these tanks have absolutely no training and virtually no experience.
This French report exposes all of that as propaganda. The article then goes on to debunk the claim made by many, and I mean many, Western experts and officials about Russia using meat assaults or human wave tactics, which, by the way, is a Hollywood invention and never has been proven to have been used by any army in battle. The article says that the reality on the battlefield is far from the widespread idea that exists in the West of a Russian army sending its troops to the butchery without counting. To date, the Ukrainian General Staff does not have a critical mass of land forces capable of joint maneuvering at the level of the Army Corps, capable of challenging their Russian counterparts in order to break through the defensive line, according to which the defense report says that the most serious error of analysis and judgment would be to continue to seek exclusively military solutions to stop the hostilities. A French official then summarizes, "It is clear in the view of the forces involved, Ukraine cannot win this war militarily." The conflict entered a second phase in December of last year. According to our military sources in Paris, the Ukrainian soldiers are deeply affected, as Zelensky would need 35,000 men per month and is not able to recruit half of that number, while President Putin draws from a pool of 30,000 monthly volunteers, according to a soldier who returned from Kiev. In terms of equipment, the balance is just as uneven. The failed offensive of 2023 would have tactically destroyed half of Kiev's 12 combat brigades. Since then, Western aid has never been so low. It is therefore clear that no Ukrainian offensive can be set up this year. The West can provide 3D printers to make drones or prowling ammunition, but will never be able to print men. The risk of a Russian breakthrough is real. This is the last lesson of the Ukrainian front, which gives cold sweats to French army observers. On February 17th, Kiev had to abandon the city of Avdiivka in the northern suburbs of Donetsk, which until then was a fortified stronghold. It was described as being both the heart and symbol of Ukrainian resistance in Russian-speaking Donbass. The Russians, the article says, have changed their modus operandi, especially by using soaring bombs on large scale for the first time, notes the document. When a 155mm artillery shell carries a 7-kilogram explosive, the saw bomb projects between 200 to 700 kilograms and therefore can pierce concrete structures of more than 2 meters. It is described as hell for the Ukrainian defenses, which would have lost more than 1,000 men per day. And that is an average of 30,000 men per month in the battle for Avdiivka. The defense document notes that the decision to withdraw the Ukrainian forces from Avdiivka was a surprise, highlighting its suddenness and underpreparedness, raising fears that this choice was more suffered than decided by the Ukrainian command. This is the key part of the assessment. It says the Ukrainian armed forces have just tactically shown that they do not have the human and material capabilities to hold a sector of the front that is subject to the effort of the attacker. The Ukrainian failure in Avdiivka shows that despite the urgent sending of an elite brigade, of which I made a video right here, Kiev was not able to totally restore a collapsing sector of the front, alarms the letter report. The last topic of this article is about the Russian art of Maskirovka. It remains to be seen, it says, what the Russians will do with this tactical success in Avdiivka. Will they continue in the current mode of snacking and a slow shaking of the entire front line? Or will they seek to pierce in depth? It says the terrain behind Avdiivka allows it according to this recent document, also warning that Western sources tend to underestimate the Russians. Well, that, my friends, is clear as daylight now. And get this part, the Russians, they say, are followers of the practice of maskira. Maskira means appearing weak when you are strong. And that is an old Sun Tzu tactic from the art of war, just like partial encirclements, which I spoke about in the collapse of Avdiivka video. And this brings to mind the theory I have held quietly for a while about this war. Why did Putin come into Ukraine with such a small force and such a weak demonstration of Russian power? The West thought it was because Russia was weak. I ask, was that done on purpose, to appear weak and lure the West into an unwinnable war, when the truth is, Russia has always been strong militarily? So the article concludes with this final assessment. After 2 years of war, the Russian forces have therefore shown their ability to develop operational endurance that allows them to wage a war of slow and long intensity based on the continuous attrition of the Russian army. A pessimistic observation for the future. So the article asks, was this new strategic situation, that is, where the Russian army seems to be in a position of strength against a Ukrainian army that is out of breath, was this reality that led French President Emmanuel Macron to consider troop reinforcements? In other words, as I suggested in my recent video, was Macron's statements more out of panic rather than authenticity?